Hey folks, welcome to this bonus episode where I'll be discussing my top 5 Paul McCartney podcasts. Thank you for tuning in, I really appreciate it. And I have to say, I've really grown to love podcasts in general, particularly music podcasts and Paul McCartney podcasts in the last couple of years. And I also want to add right at the beginning, I have tremendous respect and admiration for all the creators of podcasts. Clearly, all the podcasts I'm going to be discussing today, the creators have a tremendous love and passion and energy for the Beatles and Paul McCartney, and nothing I'm saying today is in any way meant to be a criticism of their work. I enjoy it all. I recommend all these podcasts to my listeners and to anybody watching this. They're all excellent 5-star podcasts. I'm only ranking them because I think it's a little more entertaining to do it in a ranking fashion. But don't take the rankings too seriously. I'm not. I could change these rankings easily on any given day. So let's get into them. Number 5 on my top 5 Paul McCartney related podcasts is a podcast from England. It's called Am the EggPod. Really love this podcast. Very highly produced, very professionally done. And I think what I like about this the most is the host. He does discuss all the Beatles albums and all their solo work. But what I like about this most, I think, is he always invites a guest, and the two of them discuss a given album, track by track, aspect by aspect. And I just find that dynamic of just a one-on-one discussion about each album. It's very comprehensive and it's very engaging. So I Am the EggPod, superb podcast, comes in at number 5 on my list. Number 4, which I really had a lot of heartburn with number 4 and number 3. These two are interchangeable in my view. They're both so good. Number 4 is a podcast called Two Legs. Two Legs is a podcast devoted solely to Paul McCartney's solo work. So that's what you get, Paul, all Paul. What's great about this podcast are the hosts. You have multiple hosts. They're all enthusiastic, entertaining experts on the Beatles and Paul McCartney. And another great thing about this podcast, so you get all those different views and opinions in one podcast. And you get these podcasts often. They're frequently posted, maybe every 2 weeks. So it will keep you up on all Beatle news, all Paul McCartney news. But the thing to remember in a podcast like this, with everything, what you get, you lose. So you get these great podcasts every 2 weeks. But because they're a video podcast, you're basically getting the audio of a discussion. And I have to say, I only listen to podcasts. I don't watch video broadcasts of podcasts. So I take a long walk in the morning with my dog with headphones on, and that's how I listen to my podcast usually. So I've never watched these video podcasts, but because they're basically an audio version, they're not highly edited. Sometimes, the hosts are broadcasting remotely over maybe Skype or Zoom. So sometimes there's some audio issues and things like that. They're just not as richly produced as some of the other podcasts, but you do get the high frequency of podcasts. So I love this one, and that's Two Legs. So definitely check it out. So number 3 is another British podcast. It's called Paul or Nothing. This is one that I've noticed from some reviews on iTunes. Some viewers have some issues with the host, Sam, but I don't. I think Sam has a youthful exuberance about him, and I really enjoy his take. I think what I really like about this podcast, the Paul or Nothing podcast, is I was born in 1966. I'm in my mid-50s now, 54. I believe the host is probably in his late 20s or early 30s, Sam. So I've really gotten a lot from a different perspective of Paul McCartney. I remember Wings being a band. I remember these albums being released in the 70s and 80s. I think the host here is kind of, discovering Paul McCartney's back catalog after the fact. And I find that really interesting. It's a fresh view for me as a listener. So, and it's really an engaging podcast. I enjoy it. And I just got to highlight, most recently there was an episode devoted solely to the Thrillington Project. And, if you're a Paul McCartney fan, you know about Thrillington, the instrumental version of the Ram album. But I mean, to devote a whole podcast, over 2 hours, to Thrillington and make it engaging and entertaining, that just sold me on what a great podcaster Sam is and what a wonderful podcast it is. So I would definitely check out Paul or Nothing. That brings us to podcast number 2, and that is called Fabcast. This is a great podcast, very well researched, very highly produced. It's a Beatles podcast, so it covers more than just Paul McCartney. It's the Beatles, their solo career. But I love this one. I think I love it also. One of the reasons I'm attracted to this one is I believe the hosts are New Yorkers, And I grew up in New York and grew up going to New York City all the time. I remember going to New York City, when John Lennon was still alive, and I never saw John, but I knew he was there. So I listened to the Beatles on New York radio stations, kind of grew up with that perspective. So I think that's one of the reasons I'm attracted to Fabcast. It's really just a wonderfully produced one. One of my favorite podcasts, regardless of content, it's just well done. There's also, just to highlight, a great 2-part episode on Back to the Egg. Definitely check that out if you're not familiar with this podcast. Maybe start with that one. But Fabcast is tremendous. I couldn't recommend it more highly. That's number 2 on my list. Number three. No, we're up to number 1, the grand finale. So the top podcast I'm going to recommend to you and rank for a Paul McCartney related podcast is called Take It Away, the Complete Paul McCartney Archives podcast. So Take It Away really is, when they say Complete Archives podcast, they mean it. The 2 hosts are excellent. This is richly produced, researched impeccably. It's just such a well-done podcast. It's by far, for me, the highest quality Paul McCartney podcast alone, standing alone. So it's Take It Away. And I have to thank the host. Without this podcast, I probably wouldn't have ever done my YouTube channel. I was going through this podcast, listening to them talk about Water Spout and Cage and Mama's Little Girl in 1882, and I'd grab my guitar, learn how to play the songs, and post a YouTube lesson. So I'm indebted to these hosts, and they've done such a great job with this. The one kind of let me also say, before I get to the one downside, but it's really not a downside. The way they do it is a very analytical, chronological view of Paul McCartney's solo career. So they start with the McCartney album and take you one album at a time, basically, all the way through to Egypt Station. And they go way beyond the album tracks. They go into the unreleased tracks, the outtakes, the B-sides, the production methods, the reaction at the time, the critical reaction to the albums. They really take you through everything. So it's a comprehensive review of Paul McCartney's solo catalog, and that's why I recommend it so highly. And I was going to say, it's not a downside or a criticism, but the only sad part about it is they're finished. They've completed the Paul McCartney archive. So they do release some bonus episodes, and they did a great one on the cold cuts, the non-release cold cuts. So there's a whole episode on cold cuts. But for the most part, this is one, you're not going to get new episodes very often. So this is one, if you've never listened, I'm jealous, because you can go back and binge listen to the complete Paul McCartney archives on Take It Away. You could start at the beginning with McCartney, or you can jump into any one you just want to listen to. And this is one I've gone back and re-listened to episodes. It's that good. So please give Take It Away, the complete Paul McCartney archive podcast, a listen to. So that's my top 5. I have 2 honorable mentions, which I will mention, and these are in no particular order, and they easily could have made the top 5, but I try to make some tough choices. The first one's Things We Said Today. This is another regular podcast with multiple hosts, so you're going to get this frequently, and it's going to keep you up to date on all Beatles news, Paul McCartney news, excellent discussions. These are true Beatle historians doing these podcasts, so you will learn so much. So Things We Said Today is another great one. Another excellent podcast is one called Talk More Talk. This one, I believe, is the only podcast devoted exclusively to all 4 Beatles solo careers. So it's not a Beatles podcast, not a Paul McCartney podcast. It's all 4 of the Beatles. Now, it's named after a Paul McCartney song, and I believe, Paul has the biggest catalog, so many of the episodes are devoted to Paul McCartney. But it is all 4 Beatles. And this is another one where there's multiple hosts. You get a lot of rich, varying perspectives and opinions, great discussions, superb. I think it is a video cast, so this is another one where you're listening to an audio version of a video. So you do lose some post-production work, some editing work, but it's great. Talk More Talk, certainly highly recommended. So those are all podcasts I would highly recommend for the Beatles. If there are any others you recommend to myself or any of the viewers, please drop a comment. Let me know. I'll check anything out. I'm always looking for new podcasts. And I do have a couple more kind of bonus podcasts to recommend. They're not really Paul McCartney related, but they're ones I really enjoy right now, so I figured I'd just mention them. The first one is a Beatles podcast, though, so it is Paul McCartney related. It's called Producing the Beatles. This is a fabulous podcast. It's devoted to really George Martin and his production work of the Beatles songs. So you're going to get real in-depth discussions of, say, the string arrangement for Eleanor Rigby. There's a great 20-minute episode which will teach you everything you ever wanted to know or thought you knew about Eleanor Rigby and how that was created really by George Martin, so much by George Martin and his arrangement. I'm getting so much. This is the podcast I'm into right now. I listened to 2 episodes this morning. I couldn't recommend it more strongly. And obviously there's a lot of Paul McCartney Beatles, well, all Beatle related, but a lot of Paul McCartney related aspects too. So Producing the Beatles, check out if you like. Another one is a Billy Joel podcast. Now, Billy Joel, again, growing up in New York, I grew up with Billy Joel, and I've always considered Billy Joel kind of a combination songwriter of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So I've loved Billy Joel from day one and listened to Billy Joel as I was listening to the Beatles and solo Beatles work. So this one is called Glass Houses, Billy Joel's album Glass Houses. And good news with this one is it's kind of in the early stage of the podcast. It's highly produced, it's well done. And if you want to join it, you can get in and watch it live. One comes out every couple of weeks, I think, but it's wonderful. I've learned so much about Billy Joel. It's not a chronological take. It kind of picks different Billy Joel topics, so it's very interesting, and I couldn't recommend it more. Glass Houses. And the final recommendation for a podcast is an Elton John podcast. So I also grew up with Elton John's music, and I think most Beatles fans love Billy Joel and Elton John, I would assume. But I do. I saw Elton John in New York City in 1979 when I was 13 years old. I saw Elton play with Ray Cooper, just the two of them, in the Palladium, small theater, and it changed my life. I mean, that concert. So I've always loved Elton John and appreciated his long career. And this podcast is called, I guess that's why they call it the Elton John Podcast. So it's a tongue twister name, but it's a great name. And I really love this. And this is comparable to the Take It Away Paul McCartney podcast for Elton John's catalog. So it covers everything, and I'm still going through it. I haven't gone through it all. There's a big catalog, but if you like Elton John or want to learn more about him, I guess that's why they call it the Elton John Podcast is out there, and I strongly recommend it. So thank you all, and thanks to all these podcasters. And again, if there's any other podcast you're familiar with, a viewer or just a watcher, please drop it, and I'll check it out. And let's share this with this Beatles community. It's such a wonderful kind of small world. So I'm glad we have this. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I will be posting my final 10 Paul McCartney guitar lessons. I have more to come. And I also have another bonus episode like this where I'll post my top 5 YouTube guitar teachers. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Stay safe. I'll see you soon.